3rd through 5th grade, interpreting student work. This portion of the Engage section focuses on 4 different tasks in different grade level bands and in different content areas. It also features a group of teachers using the standards level descriptors to interpret student work. This section builds on the work done by teachers in the previous modules who identified the task demands and the relevant ELP standards. This video features a 3rd grade math task. It is particularly helpful for teachers serving 3rd through 5th grade students, or really any educator seeking more models of how to interpret student work using the standards level descriptors. This math performance task from the New York Department of Education is meant to be embedded into a 4 to 5 week unit on interpreting and linking representations, modeling situations, solving non-routine problems, and justifying arguments of multiplication and division. You can access the entire performance task in supplementary materials, which include samples of student work, in the resources section of the module. For this performance task, which is meant to be completed individually, students are asked to imagine that Clear Creek School is fundraising. They are selling cookie dough in tubs. They are then given the prices per tub for chocolate chip cookie dough, peanut butter cookie dough, and oatmeal cookie dough. Please note that while there are 4 items in the original task, we are only focusing on the 4th item, which states, Jermaine's mother loves oatmeal cookies. She has $20 to spend. What is the greatest number of tubs of oatmeal cookie dough she can buy? Explain how you figured it out. Students are then given a physical space to write out their mathematical explanation. Here is the student work, which can be downloaded in the resources section. In the next few minutes, you'll watch a group of educators from Iowa, Brenda Daisy, Natalie French, Joby Lawrence, and Shaylee Santiago, collaboratively interpreting the student work using the standards level descriptors. Their discussion is included to provide you with a model of a professional learning community working together through the process of using the level descriptors to examine student work. At this point, we strongly encourage you to pause the video and download a copy of the Guide for Interpreting Student Work from the Resources section, if you have not already done so. Throughout their discussion, the educators will be referencing this guide, so you may find it difficult to follow along without it in front of you. You may also find it useful to download the expert analysis that identifies the relevant ELP standards from the previous module, as well as a copy of the level descriptors to refer to as teachers mention them during the video.
So we're going to spend some time together today looking at a 3rd grade math task. This task is called Cookie Dough, and as you might remember, in a previous set of modules, the panelists identified standards 1, 3, 8, and 9 for the English language proficiency standards addressed by this task. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at examining the identified ELP standards and the corresponding PLDs, and then we're going to try to interpret these 2 student work samples using the PLDs, and then we're going to wrap it up by identifying some strategies that we think could support the students as we look to further scaffold them in this content area. So to get started, when you think about this task, looking at the cookie dough task, we're only going to focus on question 4, because remembering back to the previous task analysis module, this is a task that asks them to think about a fundraising activity where they're selling cookie dough in tubs, and then they have a chart that outlines the different types of cookie dough with how much each tub is based on the cookie dough type. But we're only focused on question 4, which says, Jermaine's mother loves oatmeal cookies. She has $20 to spend. What's the greatest number of tubs of oatmeal cookie dough she can buy? And the student has to figure out the number of tubs based on the amount of money and use the chart to figure that out. And then they have to go a step further and explain how they figured out the mathematical response to that question. So looking at the task and then looking at the student work sample, do you think that we've picked the right standards when you look at the students' output?
I think you had said 1, 3, 8, and 9. And looking at standards 1 and 8, I think it's clear based on the students' performance in the content area that they're able to construct meaning and determine the meaning of words and things within this question and within the prompt that it's asking for. I think there could be an area for growth for the student if we look at Standard 3, writing about grade-appropriate complex informational texts.
I agree. I think that Standard 1, construct meaning, is certainly implied there. The student seems to have successfully constructed meaning. So speaking and writing about appropriate texts and topics with explain being part of the task seems to be where it hits the hardest.
I agree too. 3 seems to be the best match with the student work sample that we have.
Okay. So if we focus in on Standard 3 for this work sample, where do you think the student's performing in terms of a performance level descriptor in the PLDs? And then what information from the student work sample did you use to figure that out?
Well, what's interesting about this one is that for Standard 3, the PLD refers to composing written narratives. That isn't applicable for this math problem. In delivering a short oral presentation, we're not looking at that descriptor, but compose informational texts. I think that's where this would apply. But that part of it doesn't change across levels 3, 4, and 5, right? I'm not missing it, am I?
No, what changes is whether it's a familiar text or topic or a variety of texts and topics. And looking at this one question on one task, it's a little bit hard or challenging to tell if it's a familiar or a variety of topics for the student.
So do you think this is an example of maybe a time when originally the standards we used to plan the lesson and what we thought we were going to be addressing in the lesson may not match up with what the student work sample tells us? Because I see you guys are struggling with, at first we talked about Standard 3, but now as we're looking at it, I see you're struggling a little bit with making that make sense based on the student's work.
It seems that with Standard 3, what we've picked up on is informational text. And I'm wondering if the function of explaining fits in with informational texts or if there's somewhere else that that's better assessed.
The descriptors on the PLD chart for Standard 3 are not very,
No,
what's the word?
descriptive.
Precise, maybe? Yeah.
I wonder if this would lend itself to Standard 2, because they're exchanging information and ideas. You know, it's not quite the interactive part where they're directly communicating, but they're explaining how they figured it out.
And you know, I'm looking at this, and if you think about Standards 8 and 9, I'm wondering if this word problem and the student's description really is more about the form of language or instead of the function of language here.
Yeah,
In terms
on
of
the
the student
form,
work sample?
even thinking about, Standard 9.
And right with the sequence
Creating
of
a
events.
first.
Uh-huh.
Right. Because the student says, I skip counted by 3s. When I got to 18, I was going to skip one more, but it would then be $21.
And looking at a place to inform instruction and scaffold would be getting more at, did you introduce it? Are you recounting that sequence? How are you using connecting words to tie it together?
So it sounds like we're settling more on 9 then.
I think we're switching from Standard 3 to Standard 9.
So I wonder if we've made that choice because we sort of agree that standards 1 through 7, the function of the language has been met largely, but at this point, the student's area for growth is on the form, that development of that coherent text, being more clear with the sequence of events to describe a process.
Yes.
Okay.
So looking at Standard 9 and the PLDs, where does this student fall on this task?
Well, the introduce an informational topic under level 4 descriptor, I I don't know how you do that in the context of a question like this, so I'm not sure that that's completely relevant in this case. I think more about the recounting the sequence and the using linking words. Those two bullets for especially levels 3 and 4 are where I think the PLDs are most informative for this work sample.
Shaylee, which level were you leaning towards? 3?
Yeah, I think I'm leaning more towards 3 because if you look at the connecting words, I mean, there's the when I got to, I was going to skip more, but it would be. So nothing super complicated there. Those are just those common linking words, in other words, as opposed to some of the ones that would be.
I would expect even to see and, or next, or then at level 3. And I'm surprised not even to see an and. Sometimes that's an early stage linking word that students used. I did this, and I did this, and I did this. It seems that the student has just 2 separate ideas, 2 events, and they're in sequence, but to me they don't really seem connected. Are we saying that the when is a connection?
I almost feel like that's what's going on.
Okay.
That's what made, when I got to 18, that's how I knew I shouldn't go any further.
So I counted by 3s, first event. When I got to 18,
I was going
second event.
but is your last common linking word. I would place the student right at the beginning of a level 3 there. I think we've moved from more than 2 events. I think we've identified that there are 3 events in this student's example, and one instance of a common linking word, but we're missing some of those other common linking words, and we're not seeing any of those temporal words either.
And again, remembering this is just one sort of point in time with the students' work, and they're writing about a math problem. And so all we have to go by is just the short amount of text that they produced to answer how they figured it out. So recognizing, again, we're not saying that the student is a level 2 student. We're saying on this test they're performing at performance level. And you're saying beginning of 3? We're saying beginning of 3 for standard 9.
So what are some of those strategies then that we'd want to use to push them a little bit further?
I think maybe stronger and clearer together, where students pair up and then successively rotate, echoing back the language that they've heard, explaining a process, and having an opportunity to practice that over and over again, developing and picking up some of that language from their peers and applying it.
Even just reviewing sequence words, making sure that they had, like anchor charts or something like that available to them, and encouraging them to use sequence words in their explanation.
At a level 3, we do have the words with support, including modeled sentences. So sentence frames around the room, discourse frames like first, next, then.
Okay, then to summarize, I think that we landed on standard 9 being the standard that we think this work sample represents. And in looking at standard 9, we've identified performance level descriptor beginning of level 3. And we've identified a couple of different strategies, stronger and clearer together, and then also some other strategies that help them identify those sentence frames and those connecting words. Okay, so let's use the same process and look at another work sample. And if you're looking at the student's performance, what standard would you say we're addressing based on the student's output?
Well, this one, there's not nearly as much text, and the text that's here makes you wonder how much the student actually understood the question. This looks like what I would often encounter with students who are at beginning levels of proficiency in English. So I wonder on this one, if we need to go back to that standard 1 about constructing meaning, because I question how much the student understood from what he or she read of the prompt.
Right, I agree. It looks like the student was asked to use the figure for oatmeal cookie dough, but instead they used peanut butter cookie dough. So they seem to have misunderstood the question. Perhaps, it's hard to know, not knowing the student or the situation. But regardless, that explanation is pretty sparse.
Yes, the explanation and the language given in the explanation is sparse, and also there's no work to show really their thought process on whether or not they understood the mathematical practice or the content piece of it as well.
So based on the student's performance, how do you tease out whether this is a language or a content issue in terms of why there's such a sparse amount of information and why the students seem to have misunderstood?
Well, we can see, I mean, if he or she knows basic multiplication facts, 5 times 4 is 20, that's correct. But the problem is it's not the right information they should have been looking at. So it seems like maybe they understand, you know, those multiplication facts, but just didn't understand what the question was asking. I mean, it could also be, though, that they looked at she has $20 to spend and didn't read any further to what the question's actually asking. And so just assumed, okay, 5 times 4 is 20, that's the one I'm going to pick.
The previous question is referring to the peanut butter cookie dough. Perhaps the student on the spot was just continuing on in that
With
vein.
peanut butter cookies.
To me, that is something that is characteristic of a student at lower level, meaning that they grab onto what they know and what they understand and they stick with that.
Sometimes, too, students just are in a rush and they're not reading very carefully. So I've seen students who could perform at a higher level and they just didn't pay close enough attention to what the prompt was actually asking. So I wonder, too, is this a student who might have been rushing or hurried or distracted or, you know, having difficulty focusing on actually reading carefully in the task?
Well, you pointed out in the previous question that they were able to multiply. That question was also answered incorrectly because if you look at it, it's asking to divide and the student multiplied, but you can see that the multiplication is correct, so they have an understanding of basic facts. It makes me think it might be more of a language issue.
But I think that's the point, is the first thing to tease out is how much is it about language versus is it just mathematical calculation and understanding and reasoning.
And being able to check a student's facts and to do some basic without word math problems is a good way to check.
So with that in mind, which standard from the standards that have been identified would be most appropriate for us to zero in on?
I would agree with standard 1.
Yeah, I mean, if they're not understanding or able to make the meaning from what they're reading, how can you go further than that? So it's logical to me that we go back to standard 1 for this work sample.
Yes.
So in looking at standard 1, let's look at the performance level descriptors and see where we think the student's work sample falls in terms of performance.
I see the student was able to identify a few keywords or a keyword and more a key number. They were able to pull out $20.
So are you putting them at level 1?
So I'm looking at level 1, yes.
They seem to understand from the prompt, explain how you figured it out, that some sort of explanation or process was being asked for, and so they use the frequently occurring word because. I wonder if that implies being able to identify the main topic or message of the lesson. Maybe they're understanding that they need to explain how they figured something out, but exactly what that is, we're not quite there yet. Maybe that puts us more in a level 2.
And the answer that they produced for how many tubs is a number that makes sense in the context of it. It's not, 200 tubs with $20. I can see how that ties in with identifying the main topic or message. The first part of the question, how many tubs, and then the second part, the explain with the because that matches.
So then, to me, it's really coming down to, is it an emerging set or is it a developing set? So how early on are they in their metacognitive strategies that they're using to try to tackle this problem?
I'm leaning towards level 2.
I am too.
We don't get a lot of key details, so if you look at the level 3 descriptor that says retail key details, I don't see that at all in this student work. So I feel like level 2, it's a solid 2.
I'm wondering if the student understands the task and fell down at some point in the content. Even if the answer were accurate, a single word answer might put it at a high level 2 for me. I think that the student understands, is making meaning on what's being asked for, but there's not a lot of evidence for that meaning with a single word.
So are you comfortable with the 2?
I'm comfortable with the 2.
Okay. Okay, then to summarize, I think we decided that even though the students are working on the same task, when you look at their student work samples, that it can imply a different standard that you would be using to try to tease out what the performance level descriptor is. And in this case, we said, based on the student's work sample, we would be focused on standard 1, and we've narrowed it down to performance level descriptor 2, level 2. And so what strategies for this student would you want to engage in to try to scaffold them to the next level?
I wonder if we did like a 3 reads strategy where the student had a different purpose and was reading through the task or the prompt multiple times to kind of slow them down in their thinking and see if we can get a little bit more out of them by.
And I think that one is good as long as they have at least a basic understanding when they're reading, not knowing the student well, if it's someone who is going to struggle to make any meaning out of words. But given what we've seen, I mean, we're being able to tell that at least they can put together some part of the question. So it seems to me like the 3 reads would be a logical strategy to use with the student.
Okay, thank you.